Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming in. And thank you for Barbara for scaring everybody to come in. I'm Tom Tweed, and this is our last session of the day on sustainable habitats, how religions can repair unsustainable environments. And of course, if we actually figure out how to do that, this will be a very successful session. But having read the papers, I can tell you that the panelists have really interesting perspectives on this, and they overlap in some interesting ways. We'll follow the same procedure. I'll introduce the panelists. They'll talk for a few minutes. We'll open it. I'll give a brief response. The panelists will maybe talk about themselves for a second, and we'll open it back up, and we'll have enough time to have conversation. And following Diane Moore's rule, I think we started 7 minutes late. I love the precision of that. 7.5. Thank you very much. Good. And I think we'll go in the order of the way the sessions are on the webpage. To remind you, if you weren't in the earlier sessions, we're trying to be green, so we don't have a piece of paper. All the bios and the titles of the paper on the webpage, which is on the back of your badge. But anyway, welcome as we talk about this important topic. Why don't we begin with Nosheen Ali, who is Assistant Professor at the Institute for Educational Development at the Aga Khan University in Pakistan.
Thank you, Tom. Good afternoon and adab, everyone. I have come from Karachi for this amazing conference, and I want to just acknowledge the kindness of friends and scholars who have invited me here for the second time. I've attended a Notre Dame conference in London, and both times I was really struck by the desire of scholars here to engage with the public. It's very rare to constantly struggle with that question, and I find it a privilege to be part of this conversation. My presentation today will focus on ecology in Muslim thought and practice, and I'm looking at Tom to get my slides.
Oh, Tim, you mean?
Tim.
Yeah.
Is there something I need to press?
The slides are connected together, so when you finish your last one, there'll be a blank one, and then Mariella's will be next. I think Tim's fleeing us because we've given him so many things to do. Yeah, thanks.
I should be plugged in. We just did this test. It did work, but I don't know. My presentation was up here. I don't know how to put it back.
I see Anne going to get Tim.
Yeah, I'm hitting play. I don't think.
You could do shadow puppets or
Maybe if I do next.
The other thing we could do is perhaps reverse the order, because Dan, you don't have any. Sure. Nosheen, why don't we reverse the order until we get Tim and be adaptable.
Okay, that's fine.
Which is a good thing, perhaps, and sustainable. Did you find it? Is it ready? No, okay. Tim will come. This is the universe telling us that we should change the order. We will obey. Why don't we start with Dan Castillo, who is Assistant Professor of Theology at Loyola, Maryland. Dan?
Good afternoon, and I'm grateful to be here. In my remarks here, I would like to consider the task and potential contribution of theology to the ongoing struggle for a just and sustainable world. I speak as a Roman Catholic theologian working out of that tradition. Nonetheless, my hope is that these comments regarding Catholic theology might be extended in ways that are helpful and meaningful to other religious traditions. My focus here is in this paper is on the relationship between the life of faith and the preferential options for the poor and the earth. Since the Second Vatican Council, the term preferential option for the poor has become ubiquitous in Catholic theological discourse. In brief, The term expresses the view that intrinsic to the life of faith is the work of confronting, unmasking, and repairing the ways in which death-dealing poverty characterizes the world. The preferential option for the poor, then, orients communities of faith towards ways of living in solidarity with poor, marginalized, and oppressed persons in the world. Importantly, the preferential option for the poor is understood to be intrinsic to Christian discipleship. It is located at the heart of faith. This is because the symbols and narratives that form the Christian religious imagination, from Exodus to Jesus' proclamation of the reign of God to the lives of the saints, have all consistently been interpreted to testify to the view that God is one who hears and responds to the cry of the poor. In recent years, there has been a growing tendency within theology to affirm the need to proclaim not only a preferential option for the poor, but an option for the earth as well. The call to embrace the option for the earth, which finds a high point in Laudato Si', stems from the acknowledgement that non-human creation and the ecosystems they constitute, along with humans, of course, have their own inherent value and integrity that humans must learn to discern and respect. Nonetheless, the theological grounding for the option for the earth is less developed within the dominant form of modern Catholic religious imagination than is the option for the poor. For many, the option for the earth appears to lie at the periphery of the life of faith. This is because, in part, the symbols and narratives of the Christian faith that in their interpretation have proven so hospitable to grounding the option for the poor can appear disconnected from the option for the earth. It is often unclear to communities of faith that the Exodus, the reign of God, or the lives of the saints have anything to do with care for creation. This brings me to my first thesis. Theology must work to retrieve, reinterpret, and reconstruct its religious symbols and narratives in ways that establish the foundations not only for the option for the poor, but also for the option for the earth. In so doing, theology can help to place care for creation at the heart of the life of faith, and thereby help to both orient and energize communities of faith to both hear and mercifully respond to the cry of the earth. At this point, it may be helpful to consider one concrete example of the interpretive theological work that I call for. And here I turn to reflect on the claim that the human person is created in the image of God, the theological symbol of Imago Dei. In the Bible, the most prominent reference to Imago Dei is found in the first creation narrative of Genesis, where the human person is explicitly described as being created in the image and likeness of God. This claim has had an important history within the Catholic tradition. For centuries, it has been appealed to in defense of the dignity of the human person. Likewise, in the second half of the 20th century, Imago Dei has provided theological and ethical warrant for grounding the preferential option for the poor. In recent decades, however, the symbol Imago Dei has come under attack for a number of reasons. For my purposes here, the most pertinent concern is that the symbol can be used to sanction a destructively anthropocentric worldview in which the human person is accorded dignity over and against non-human creation. This concern appears to be underscored by the divine command in Genesis 1 for the human person to subdue the earth and exercise dominion over the living creatures of the world. In the traditional way of conceiving of Imago Dei, then, this symbol seemingly places the option for the poor in an agonistic relationship with the option for the earth. It functions to defend the dignity of the human person, but simultaneously appears to provide warrant for human domination of the earth. For this reason, Mary Catherine Hilkert worries that Imago Dei has become, quote unquote, a threatened symbol, one that may prove difficult to retrieve fruitfully within the present context of ecological crisis or ecological emergency. In order to identify how the symbol of Imago Dei might continue to be retrieved productively for the Christian imagination in a time of ecological emergency, I turn to the second creation narrative in Genesis, the narrative of the Garden of Eden. There, a careful reading of the text surfaces an implicit Imago Dei anthropology, one that in fact binds together the options for the earth and poor. In Genesis 2:15, God calls the human person to cultivate and care for the garden soil. Here, the person is called to utilize her agential capacity to work with creation in ways that are informed by an ethos of care and preservation. Indeed, this view is reinforced when one observes that in 2:15, the Hebrew term cultivate, avad, can be translated as serve. As Ellen Davis writes, avad connotes working for the garden soil, serving its needs. Moreover, the vocation given in 2:15, what I term the symbolic vocation of gardener, conveys the view that the loves of God, neighbor, and earth are intimately interconnected. As Ted Hebert argues, the implicit object of the human person's cultivation and care is the garden's arable soil. Here, however, we can note that in Genesis 2, God fashions the creatures of the earth and sky, including the human person, out of this arable soil. It is reasonable then to interpret the object of service and care not simply as the soil, but rather as the soil and all that comes from the soil. Thus, in serving God by properly responding to the vocation of gardener, the human person cares for both neighbor and earth. These three objects of human love, God, neighbor, and earth, are inextricably interconnected by the vocation of gardener. Love of God is expressed through the love of neighbor and earth, with neighbor and earth as closely related as the human is to the soil. Strikingly, the second creation narrative of Genesis implicitly presents the vocation of gardener as constitutive of Imago Dei. In Genesis 2, God is imaged as the first gardener. God is the one who plants the garden and makes the fruit-bearing trees grow in it. Thus, within the semiotic landscape of the second creation narrative, the human person comes to inhabit the image of God most fully, precisely through serving and caring for the garden of the earth. The gardener is Imago Dei. On this interpretation of the symbol, then, Imago Dei provides clear warrant for both the option for the earth and poor. Indeed, the implicit Imago Dei anthropology of Genesis 2 indicates that these options are inextricably intertwined with one another and intrinsic to the life of faith. In the interest of time, I now sharply pivot to my second thesis. It is not enough for theology simply to elucidate the connection between faith and the options for the poor and earth in the ahistorical abstract. Theology must also work to historicize these options by venturing to speak about how they can be made manifest within the present-day context of the global eco-social emergency. With regard to my foregoing argument, theology must reflect upon how communities of faith can incarnate the vocation of gardener in the world today. In working to historicize the options for the earth and poor, two key points should be kept at the foreground. First, theology must take absolutely seriously the history of colonial and neo-colonial extractive economies that have continually plundered the soil and all that comes from it within the regions of the predominantly brown and black global South, and for the purpose of aggrandizing the predominantly white global North. Any attempt to conceive of the options for the poor and the earth that does not take these histories into account will be inadequate. Second, theologians should scrutinize their own contemporary geopolitical context with a hermeneutic of suspicion. They would do well, for example, to cast a suspicious eye toward the language of sustainable development. When the term sustainable development was first used in the 1987 UN Brundtland report, the report acknowledged that painful choices would have to be made in order to sustain the flourishing of life on Earth. It is striking then that this acknowledgement has vanished from contemporary discussions of sustainability. Instead of wrestling with the reality of difficult trade-offs, the discourse of sustainable development is now predominantly couched in terms of win-win scenarios. This shift is indicative of a situation in which the discourse has been captured by hegemonic interests whose priority is not to sustain the resilience capacity of the earth, but to ensure and sustain the continuous exploitation of the earth in an effort to secure ever-increasing amounts of wealth. More work must be done to clarify precisely what the contemporary globalization project is structured to sustain. In sum, the task of theology is twofold. It must work to interpret its symbols and narratives in ways that can ground the options for the earth and poor, and theology must work to historicize these options. In so doing, the discipline can contribute to a world that better hears and responds to the cries of the earth and poor. Thank you.
Next, Nosheen Ali is Assistant Professor, Institute for Educational Development, and still at the Aga Khan University in Pakistan.
So I was joking with Daniel yesterday that, I really enjoyed your paper. I wish you would go before me, because your critique of sustainable development is something I wish I had put in my paper, but I didn't. And so God is working here, don't you see?
I wasn't going for God, but okay.
So thank you again. I'm not going to connect my paper directly to the violence of sustainable development and its contemporary rhetoric of win-win solutions. And in fact, just today I got an invitation to be a consultant, and it talked about value for money, VFM, which is the new term. I was educated today, and all pretense that we're going to care about the earth and sustainability has something to do with sustainable use of resources is gone, as Daniel pointed out. So I want to reaffirm and his point about the horrible rhetoric of sustainable habitats and sustainable development, which has gone in a completely different direction than the concern for climate change. Right? The concern for climate change has gone up. Countries are trying to do something, but the policies on the ground are decidedly extractive. They are decidedly exploitative. They are decidedly entrenching the capitalist system that has been responsible for unsustainable habitats in the first place. So I'll leave aside a little bit of politics and in my presentation and talk about the multiple meanings of nature, ecology in Muslim thought and practice. The title of my presentation is The Reed Laments, Ecology in Muslim Thought and Practice. So there are two concerns here. What is nature and ecology when you translate it in local languages in Pakistan and India? I work on Muslim life worlds in Sindh, Punjab, and Gilgit-Baltistan in Pakistan, but also in parts of Gujarat and Bengal in India. So much of the reflections in this paper come from my ethnographic fieldwork in Pakistan and India. The very word nature, when translated in Urdu, means kudrat. And when you say kudrat, kudrat literally means God's miracle, blessing, and creation. So when we use languages like nature and environment, we know that nature is sacred, but I want to communicate where you don't need to say that in a language like Urdu or Hindi or Punjabi or Sindhi and 20 different languages across 1 billion people plus, because the very word for nature is sacred. It is God's miracle. It's impossible to think of nature outside of a religious framework. And I think this is a fundamental point I want to make for educational initiatives, as well as initiatives that talk about religious literacy and Muslim cultural literacy. They completely evade language and terminology. So that's the first point that I want to make. Within Islamic tradition, within Muslim religious practice, cultural practice, ecological practice, within South Asian practice, nature is sacred. You cannot talk about it in technical terms. I'll give you an example from Shimshal in Gilgit-Baltistan, which is part of disputed Kashmir as well as ruled by Pakistan. This is from my own fieldwork when a Shimshali activist was trying to explain to me how his notion of nature connects to conservation and development. So he says that nature is God's blessing, rahmat. Therefore, people's relationship with nature is one of respect and thankfulness. We celebrate many festivals thanking God and nature. But one also has to work hard in order to benefit from God's blessings. To get from nature, you have to give to it and be respectful and thankful. So there is no need for conservation in Qudrat because it has an inbuilt mechanism of conservation. This is a very critical point because if you have a cultural, spiritual, and ecological framework, which Qudrat really is, I'm providing it here as a theoretical framework, if you like, although I'm just playing with language. If you look at Qudrat, what it actually does is that it helps us understand why Shimshal in Gilgit-Baltistan, for example, is one of the world's most precious biodiversity hotspot with a lot of rare wildlife species such as the snow leopard, ibex, and markhor. It is not a coincidence that this community of 1,700 people, only 1,700 people, over the last 1,000 years have managed to preserve an incredibly diverse landscape. It comes directly from their spirito-cultural, ecological worldview in which mountains are sacred and these pastures are holy and there are spirits reigning here. And the fundamental concept of nature itself tells you that human labor must complement nature's existing ways. So environmental learning in the context of Shimshal means how do we learn from nature to replicate it rather than to challenge it and destroy it. And it was a very significant learning for me as a development activist working with WWF and IUCN, in which local villagers were often seen as a threat rather than as the solution for modern conservation. So this inbuilt mechanism of conservation comes directly from faith. And I want to emphasize that point. I'll give you another, I have tons of examples of what counts as ecological practice and simultaneously as cultural practice. Can people read this? It's just, okay. I actually need to read this somewhere here. So this practice was shared with me by a student just last week in a class. That Kutch Hirik is a custom practiced by shepherd communities in Gilgit-Baltistan. The juniper tree Saruzk is known as a holy tree which belongs to the Shavana Nangini, the heavenly creatures. When a child is born or taken to the pastures for the first time, he or she is formally introduced with the nature by hugging the wild Sarzgos tree. After hugging the tree, the child is kept alone beneath the tree on the soil for a few minutes. Then the mother of the child chops a shoot from the tree, keeps the shoot in the mouth of the child and sweeps around her body. Then the same shoot is burnt to smoke. The smoke is sprayed around the body of the child, and this smoke is called kushik. It is still believed that kushik purifies the body and soul. These are one of the many ordinary daily practices in which people and nature not only coexist, but the word they often use is taking ijazat or permission from nature. If you have to go hunting, you have to take permission from nature. And I thought this beautiful practice, which in English would translate to opening the doors of nature to a newborn, is a wonderful initiation, a blessing ceremony. When we talk about Islamic culture or Muslim culture, we often talk about the azan, that the first thing that Muslims do is that they put a prayer in the ears of a newborn. But there are many Islams, there are many Muslim practices, and there are many indigenous religions which would connect to this practice as well. So the argument that I'm trying to make is, how do we think of sustainable habitats when we spiritualize our very conception of nature? Because the intervention that I want to make here is, and I know this causes a lot of secular discomfort, it causes a lot of leftist discomfort back in my own country, but I strongly believe from what I've learned in my fieldwork that unless we see ecology as a spiritual concept, and unless we see that the indigenous communities that have actually preserved the earth rather than city dwellers and urban consumers, unless we really take seriously their faith traditions, we are not going to make headway. Across faiths, the norm in South Asia is the sacred conception of nature, but it's routinely denied legitimacy in mainstream notions of science, because of course all of this is superstitious. Social science and environmental education. I teach indigenous students from Sindh and Gilgit-Baltistan, and they routinely tell me that their inherited practices from their grandmothers and their grandfathers are crap. They belong to the past, they're not modern. They dismiss their own sensibilities because, of course, the modern education system does not value their ecological, cultural, or spiritual sensibility. So what do we need to do? Somebody asked us, what's the solution? Well, here's one argument, that we need to value the metaphysical, cultural, indigenous, and spiritual dimension of nature in order to transform the world from a fragmented, exploitative understanding of the environment towards a holistic one centered on, nurturing relationships. That's the first part of my presentation. The second point that I want to make is, let's look at the practice of saints in Islam, but I'm sure this will be true across traditions as well. When you look at saintly asceticism in Islam, one of the key figures that I have studied is the famous figure of Baba Farid, who lived in the 12th century. He is a renowned Sufi master of the Chishtiya Silsila, as well as a revered Sikh Bhagat. So overlapping religious saints, again, extremely common across South Asia. You don't have to do an interfaith dialogue on them. They're just overlapping. I've been to Baba Farid's death anniversary, which annually attracts 1 million people in Punjab, including from many, many parts of the world. So we're talking, and not just a historical dead figure, but an immensely powerful, popular saint in contemporary Pakistan and India. If you look at the saint's life, and if you look at his poetry, which form part of my paper but are not part of my presentation here, he embraced poverty, equality, and anti-accumulation as the essence of religion. I really want to emphasize the anti-accumulation bit, because fakiri, which in Urdu and in Muslim culture means the wandering mendicant, the begging saint, the fakir. There are many words for fakir, but saintly ascetics is one translation. Fakiri, there is nothing challenges capitalism more than fakiri, where someone says, I'm poor and proud to be poor. I reject your consumerism. I reject your accumulation. There was an overt, direct, lived example of wealth distribution rather than wealth accumulation. And one has to wonder, why is a saint popular after 1,000 years? And people don't flock to these shrines out of superstition. They have inspiration at work here. And this is not some, when we think of the spiritual, often we think of, some really ethereal characteristic, and we divorce it of the material realm. And Baba Farid was one of the first, the leftist in me would say Marxist, because he creates a commune. He creates a commune in casteist India, where Hindus and Muslims and low caste and high caste have to sit together and eat. And everything that is given to him every day has to be distributed that same day. No hoarding allowed. No collection allowed. These are powerful inspirations that counter the ideals of hierarchy, ownership, and commercialism. And I want to emphasize this with the indigenous Shimshali practice in northern Pakistan, because they constantly emphasize stewardship of the earth rather than ownership. Again, this is a similar dialectic that we hear from many faith traditions. And I want to emphasize that these values, these shared frameworks come from spirituality. And they're located in spirituality, but often denied value even in religious teachings. Finally, I think promoting a faith that is both anti-materialistic and ecologically sustainable is needed in the tradition of Islam. I'll end my presentation. I mean, these are a series of reflections. I'm sorry if they're incoherent or not too connected, but I'll end with Rumi's famous Masnavi. And, you know, Rumi is a 13th century Muslim philosopher, poet. We all know who he is. I also study poetic traditions, and till today, till I was writing for this paper, Rumi's Masnavi is the ode to the beloved. It's the sort of doctrine for love, and, you know, it has been analyzed in many different ways. It begins with a chapter called The Song of the Reed. How many of you are familiar with the opening lines of the Masnavi? Great. So the opening lines of the Masnavi, and, you know, because I had to think ecologically, I was amazed by the translation. So the Song of the Reed, if you read the Urdu translation, would translate as the complaint of the reed. The shikayat of the tree part that has been severed from the tree to make the flute which the musician supposedly creates music from and believes that he or she is creating beauty. So the beginning of the Masnavi, Muslim tradition's most famous poet, probably the world's most famous poet, begins with a complaint of nature against humans. And I'll just put it out here. It's a very bad English translation, by the way, but I have no choice. From green flute, I hear what the tale it tells, what plaint it makes of absence's ills. From jungle bed, since me they tore, men's, women's eyes have wept right sore. My breast I tear and rend in twain, to give, through sighs, vent to my pain. Who's from his home snatched far away, longs to return some future day. This is the lament of the reed. It's a lament of nature's suffering at the hands of the human who thinks he's creating pleasure and beauty at the cost of the reed. I don't want to say too much there, but I was very struck by the ecological pain at the heart of beauty that Rumi points us to, and I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our final speaker is Mariella Bacigalupo, professor of anthropology, University of Buffalo in New York State.
Thank you so much, Tom, for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for your generosity and your wisdom today. I really appreciate it. I'm the last speaker, so I sort of feel that I either have to give you a narrative apocalypse or a narrative of hope, and maybe I'll give you a little bit of both. I'm going to take you today to Peru, where I'm from. Peru is the third worst country in the world in terms of the impact of climate change. But it's also a place where we can see the ways in which if we problematize our categories and allow these categories to be effectively used by people in local contexts, that it can really make a world of difference. And the title of my talk today is The Subversive Politics of Sentient Landscapes, Collective Ethics, Environmental Justice in Peru. So as moral and environmental crises have wreaked havoc around the world, communities, scholars, activists, and sometimes even national governments are beginning to recognize the agency of the sacred landscapes in fostering or mitigating these crises. I'm writing an ethnography about how poor Peruvian mestizos in the coastal desert Moche and Chicama valleys in the valleys of the Libertad, northern Peru, draw on indigenous Moche spiritual traditions to collaborate with sacred, sentient landscapes made by ancestors called huacas and honorable ancestor mountains, apus, to promote collective ethics and environmental justice. Now, sacred landscapes with sentience, morality, and agency challenge academic distinctions between non-human and human, nature and culture, as well as colonialist capitalist divisions between species, landscapes, and people. Sentient landscapes can act upon humans through cosmopolitics, a kind of in-place politics that unpend Western perceptions of the human. But what do these sacred, sentient landscapes contribute to our understandings of collective ethics and environmental justice? And how do people and sentient places attempt to address the moral and environmental crisis of our neoliberal world? Now, expansive humanism and the idea of sentient landscapes interacting with humans have been theorized in multiple ways by different scholars, although rarely with an eye towards environmental justice and collective ethics. Scholars of Latin America like Marisol de la Cadena and Eduardo Con, for example, have written about radically different worlds of sentient beings and the existence of multiple or alternative ways of being in the world. Others, like Elizabeth Povinelli, have criticized the forms of governance implemented by regimes of late settler liberalism. Still others have written widely about values and moral selves. However, none of these approaches address the ways in which poor Peruvian mestizo workers challenge neoliberalism and attempt to reverse their exploitation by the extractive industries by drawing on sentient landscapes. And these sentient landscapes become moral co-creators and spiritual leaders in movements for environmental justice and collective ethics, rather than being viewed as beings incommensurable from the modern world of politics, who remain absent from negotiations with the state or environmental movements, which is some of the arguments that Marisol de la Cadena had put forth. Now, Apus and Huacas emerged as moral beings after 2014, and this is when the region was devastated by the effects of mining, aggregate industries, and also by floods that were exacerbated by climate change. Peruvian leaders believed that the investment would solve the problem, yet their treatment of the economy, the environment, and human health as unconnected domains has had disastrous consequences. So state-supported industries produce and reproduce non-democratic hierarchies, structural violence, and environmental degradation, their exploitation of nature mirroring their exploitation of poor mestizo workers. Now, curanderos, mestizo shamans, and other poor mestizos in the valleys, in contrast, attribute floods to angry but moral landscapes, forcing people to focus on the collective good by punishing those who are destroying the world. They speak of Apus and Huacas as ancestors, the highest spiritual and Gnostic authority of indigenous past, who nurtures collective and ecological values. And also as intentional actors in their struggle to counteract environmental change. By working with sentient landscapes, poor mestizos ground a collective ethics in place and grapple with resource exploitation, climate change, and greed as a single problem. Curanderos invoke Apus, Huacas, and Catholic shrines through the objects on their mesas in their healing and divination rituals, and link environmental devastation associated with climate change to systemic violence and human health. Curanderos meld the agency and morality of Apus and Huacas expressed through dreams and visions with scientific discourses and with their own measurements of the effect of climate change through biometric readings. As poor mestizos have seen the connections between the actions of Apus and Huacas, curanderos' observations, and environmental science, they have also understood the consequences of overexploitation simultaneously in environmental, moral, and social terms. Curanderos also incorporate a syncretized Saint Cyprian and as an ambivalent curandero, Apu, and Jesus as a moral one. Omar Ñiqui, a mestizo curandero from the Moche Valley, elaborated. Apus and Huacas have a higher consciousness. They are protectors of the resources of the earth. Scientists do not understand that floods, deluges, and climate change are caused by the anger of Apus and the Huacas due to human corruption. But we know this, and that is why we're working together with our Apus to counteract destruction and corruption through rituals and our environmental organizations. Now, what happened in 2014 is that poor mestizos led by these shamans incorporated Apus and Huacas into two environmental movements. The first is Asociación de Rescate y Defensa Apucampana, which we see here, which is one of the big mountain Apus of the area. And the second is Colectivo Comunidad Consciente. And these two local environmental movements were created in 2014. Through these movements, poor mestizos demand legal recognition of Apus and Huacas as legal persons and follow their lead to try and counteract the disastrous consequences of climate change, neoliberalism, and corruption. Poor mestizos contest the unequal distribution of ecological costs and benefits and attempt to recreate a world of value by using fundamental indigenous forces for political purposes. These sacred, sentient landscapes challenge Western assumptions and create a new model for political mobilization, which hopefully can be used in other contexts as well. The morality and agency of apus and huacas and the actions of curanderos and communities shape the well-being of people and the planet. The vulnerabilities produced by climate change have catalyzed a rethinking of values and the promotion of movements for change that reconcile these cosmopolitics of sentient places with scientific discourses and political activism. Thank you.
Thank you so much for 3 great papers. You can see why I was excited, I think. I'll offer a few words of response, and then we'll let the panelists talk among ourselves here for a second, and then open it up. We'll have plenty of time for conversation. The panelists identify spiritual resources for confronting environmental degradation. The geographical focus shifts from South Asia to Latin America as the speakers consider Christian, Muslim, and indigenous traditions and engage multiple disciplines, in case you didn't notice that, anthropology, theology, and history. Scholars of Islam have pointed to ideas in that tradition that might be helpful for crafting an ecological ethic. One scholar suggests that 3 Quranic notions are foundational for reimagining humans' relationship with the natural world: the principle of divine unity, the idea that nature reflects the unity, harmony, and beauty of God's handiwork, the notion of trusteeship, which was mentioned, the notion that humans are stewards of Allah's creation, and third, the belief in the hereafter, the idea that humans will be accountable on the day of judgment for how well they've served as faithful stewards. Nosheen's paper, Ecology in Muslim Thought and Practice, mentions that stewardship and highlights other Islamic resources, including how residents of Shimshal village in northern Pakistan imagine creation, nature, as a divine blessing that demands respect and gratitude, and that's modified. I thought this is an important part in your paper that's emphasized. It's always a landscape modified by human labor. There's no such thing as landscapes and human work. She also suggests that ascetic spirituality, which valorizes poverty and rejects accumulation. I thought of Dorothy Day's voluntary poverty and other things, long traditions of asceticism, promotes a kind of mode of living that's more ecologically and socially sustainable. And for me, as some of you know, sustainability is, I think we need to broaden the concept. It's a habitat's only sustainable if it's peaceful and just and a lot ecologically environmental. So for me, it's a more elastic notion. To illustrate, she considers the poetry of the 13th century ascetic of the Punjab region, Baba Farid, and Nosheen suggests that his poetry favors poverty simplicity, rejects greed and grandiose living, and thereby offers a profound vision for just sustainable development, one that respects the earth as a habitat for multiple species. In her paper, The Spiritual Leadership of Sentient Landscapes, Mariella notes how poor mestizos in northern Peru view indigenous sites as living beings. We heard that in both papers a little bit. Sacred ancestors, even as leaders in the social movement to reverse the damage and rebuild sustainable habitats. The Plur blend indigenous and Catholic traditions to create new models for political mobilization. Since the flooding of those mudslides in 2014, they formed grassroots environmental movements, including one which argues that the mountain is a sacred ancestor, a person, and therefore deserving of protection. Mariella warns, however, that locals today rely less on the indigenous ideal of reciprocity, while the mestizos want to avoid climactic punishment for contaminating sacred places and for failing to do the appropriate rituals. They seem more interested, she suggests, in personal gain, and you trace it, I think, to the internalized Catholic beliefs. They suggest humans are superior to nature, the kind of thing that Daniel was wrestling with earlier. And Daniel, a theologian, wants to reimagine how Catholics understand that relationship. That's how I saw the relationship with your papers, and hopes to reformulate a kind of broader ethic of creation grounded in both the preferential option for the poor and a preferential option for the earth. He proposes two strategies for moving forward. First, that we retrieve the symbol of Imago Dei, the notion that humans are created in the image of God, but that we should challenge that first creation story in Genesis, which is where we find subdue, dominion, and that kind of talk. Instead, we should shift to the talk in Genesis 2:15 to the story of the Garden of Eden. And that biblical narrative presents humans as gardeners obliged to work with and for the soil. I thought one thing was really resonant and interesting was your reading of it is you're not just working with the soil, you're working for it. Second, with that notion of the gardener restored, we should historicize the preferential option for the poor and the earth. And something we've been emphasizing, and certainly I have too, the brutal legacy of Western colonial plunder across the global South, as we just have to acknowledge the history of that. That means we should be suspicious of development projects, Dan suggests, even or especially ones that claim to be sustainable, but fail to address the legacy of colonial extractivism, the taking out of resources. Despite obvious differences, I see parallels in these papers, and you might see other ones that we'll bring forward. Let me just mention a few questions and some observations, and then we'll open it up. First, a question for each panelist. I wonder what continuities you see among you. Which belief or practice or institution mentioned in another panelist's paper seems most potentially helpful to you as you strategize for change, as you try to reconceptualize things? What can we learn from each other? And then a few observations about the three papers. I think each of you identify ways that devotees have challenged the dominant Abrahamic view of nature as separate from humans and the modern capitalist view of nature as a resource to be exploited for gain. I heard that. The papers highlight ideas and practices from agricultural festivals in northern Pakistan to grassroots movements in northern Peru. Those kinds of rituals that reimagine human, non-human relationships. Both Nosheen and Mariella talk about how villagers see the natural landscape as a sentient being, as a person, or at least spaces, and sometimes where they're just teeming with such beings. And if the religious don't perform the appropriate rituals or convene the seasonal festivals, angry spirits or beings can unleash floods, mudslides, earthquakes, as in northern Peru, or make the crops fail, as in northern Pakistan. If we don't, at the beginning of the season, we need to do certain things and invite them. At the end, after harvest, we have to thank them and invite them back. So ritual makes things, the causal force in some of this is ritual action. Each of you address poverty, a second continuity, and the link between environmental degradation and economic disparity. I wonder if there are other intersections. Doesn't climate change affect women and children more directly? Are there other ways in which it isn't just about poverty? Is it about other things? One of the pressing problems for those who think about environmental issues is that alarming scientific reports about the effects of climate change don't prompt immediate and effective action, something that I've been thinking about with my colleagues in that project about climate justice. So I'm just trying to get help here. So how can we better motivate officials and ordinary folks to change what they do? As Mariella notes, self-interest often enters the picture. And we're thinking in that project, Atik Rahman, Robert Audi, and I, about how maybe we need to think about how to expand our understanding of self-interest beyond our place and this generation. Maybe we need a transgenerational and transcontinental ethic. And I think other traditions, just to throw Buddhism in here, we wanted to have smaller panels, but we could have. I think some other traditions offer some other help that might be interesting to think about. For example, the Buddhist symbol of Indra's net and the doctrine of intercausality or codependent origination, which suggests that everything reflects every other thing. If you know the image of Indra's net it's literally that there's no such thing as autonomous objects or beings. Everything reflects everything else, and the notion that everything is intercausally related. both helps us think about there's no such thing as nature and non-nature. Buddhists also have their own idea of a future retribution, the idea of karma. There was themes of kind of punishment coming through some of the papers, namely the view that our actions have direct and inevitable consequences for ourselves and everything else. There needs to be no divine intervention. You don't have to get the gods or spirits angry. It just automatically flows. So what retribution seems to be, or a future, the hereafter, might be one way of thinking it. But I wonder if you think that the threat of spiritual retribution might lead to behavioral change. I mean, if people thought more seriously, I'm not sure. In Peru, mestizos interpret that climate-induced weather events as just retribution. And in Pakistan, Muslims are reminded of future judgment if they fail to safeguard Allah's creation. In Daniel's vision, I think I gather that the recognition of this brutal colonial legacy should lead to collective repentance and transformative action. Is that right? Yeah. But if neither interconnection, a kind of Buddhist and indigenous versions, or retribution, Christian, Muslim, some other way, are the most helpful spiritual themes for crafting an ethic that promotes communities that are just, peaceful, and ecologically responsible. So which ideas or practices might be most promising? I'm not sure that those two don't help, but I hear proposals here about reciprocity from Mariella, about Imago Dei from Daniel, and about asceticism, among other things, from Nosheen. So what might be the most useful? And is there an idea or practice that might find acceptance across traditions? The first question is, what seems to be the most useful pragmatically at this particular moment? And is there one that might actually find acceptance across traditions, one that respects differences but identifies shared beliefs that might prompt responsible action? Those are just some first thoughts. And why don't we open it up and give folks in the panel some things you want to say here, and then we'll open it up to everybody else. Anybody want to start?
Thank you, Tom, for your response. Thinking about the number of questions that you laid out for us, I guess first with regard to the symbol of Imago Dei, I would just speak directly to absolutely correct that the symbol can't be taken by itself, but put into the broader constellation of symbols that comprise like the story of salvation within the Christian imagination. And so this kind of understanding of the human person would have to be put into relationship with sin. Well, sin is a distortion of right relationship. And what I'm trying to show here is that we can think of that as a part of that is relationship to the earth. So then salvation, which requires repentance and turning away and repairing the damage of sin, means confronting the harm we've done to the earth. I'll say one more thing as far as what continuities have I seen from other papers from previous sessions. One thought that is idea that was surfaced before that's particularly helpful and I think important is problematizing the north-south, global north, global south binary. That there is a history of colonial exploitation in the global north and that it needs to be attended to. And as I was reflecting on my as I was doing my pregame, I recalled a passage from James Cone, the Protestant theologian who just died, and he wrote this: "The logic that led to slavery and segregation in the Americas, colonization and apartheid in Africa, and the rule of white supremacy throughout the world is the same one that leads to the exploitation of animals and the ravaging of nature. It is a mechanistic and instrumental logic that defines everything and everybody in terms of their contribution to the development and defense of white world supremacy." This is true in myriad social locations, both global north and global south. I live in Baltimore. Baltimore has a colonial history of exploitation and extractivism, and those types of issues need to be surfaced and taken into account.
I wonder if either of you are thinking about ideas or practices that you heard among the panelists or other papers too.
Sure. Okay. Thank you for these beautiful papers, and also for your comments, Tom. I guess there are a couple of things I thought about, and for me, one of the most important things I took out of some of the discussions that we've been having all day is, one is the need to problematize our categories. And I think you said very beautifully, like the kinds of consequences, the way in which this sort of colonization, this ravaging, right, of the world has been precisely through these categories that have enabled the kind of structural violence and also violence against, nature and so on that's been occurring. So this idea of making like structural, and also the other thing is like making structural violence, like one of the main things of making that explicit. And I think it was Diane who said that, right? But there's something it's really important to make that explicit, and also see how does it tie into these kind of discourses that can emerge, in terms of hope and so on. I see the, sure, I mean, of course, you have the punitive, I mean, you have the idea of interconnection with nature is important, and the idea of retribution is being important. But I think something else that I saw emerging in all of our papers, and I think is central to our analysis, is the idea of the collective good, right? And how do we, express that collective good in these movements in a way that's going to be, thinking about how we can read a dialogue that's going to expand the kind of categories that we had. And I think all of our papers sort of tapped into this idea, and maybe I'm sorry if I'm misrepresenting you, so forgive me if I am. But this idea that, that we can no longer think about the human in this very sort of constrained way of thinking about it. We need to think about it in a much broader sense. And I think that sort of broadening of the human and thinking about the collective good as we are in relationship with nature and so on, even if you want to think about calling it a different name or not, might be different. I mean, the case that you brought up, that was very important, I think, as a central one. The other question that you asked, which was about relationship to Catholicism, I'm not sure. I think it's complicated, and how do we engage that? Because, the area where I'm working was, of course, we're subject to the extirpation of idolatries from, basically 1729 until 1925, which is huge. And in that extirpation of idolatries, it included, you cannot, recognize animals or, landscapes, mountains or lakes of having sentient agency. So that's one of the ways in which those categories were, colonized and brought back. And I think it's fascinating that there's a sort of this is sort of, what happened is it doesn't disappear, it just goes under the surface, and then it reemerges in this new kind of context. So, I mean, I know that they have been Catholic priests who have sort of demonized the mountains and so on, but there's also a way in which they're trying to find a dialogue with Catholicism precisely by sort of challenging the structure of the church and going to the kinds of Catholicism you were talking about, which is the ideas of the poor, where Saint Cyprian is this ambivalent sentient mountain, and where Jesus, fine, we'll let him be moral, but he's moral only to the extent that he's going to help us in these movements for collective ethics and environmental justice. So that's where his morality lies.
Yeah. Just a couple of points in response to your fantastic comments. Thank you. I think what I see as resonating, and you identified that, Tom, as well, is our insistence from our anthropological, theological, poetic, whatever vantage points, on taking the spiritual seriously, on taking the spiritual as essential. Forget developing spiritual themes across cultures, just that is absolutely crucial. And that recognition, at least from a lot of, South Asian environmental conversations that I'm part of, or environmental justice movements, is absolutely absent. People like the question yesterday, religion, sustainable development, what's the connection? Because it's all about prayer and piety at the end of the day. Environment has nothing to do with it. And the moment you enter lived practice, or there are many interpretations of Quran or the Genesis where you can talk about the gardener in similar ways, or the shepherd, or, different metaphors. But beyond those textual interpretations is the reality of language and practice, where ecology is a spiritual concept. that construction is very hard to challenge, because I actually think science is the problem there. You would not have modern developmentalism as a problem if that scientific worldview had not dominated, that humans dominate over nature and nature is not sentient and so on. So the first thing is to take the spiritual seriously. And the second thing, I'll just speak from my own practice. I started a community research farm and learning center called Karti Dharti, 3 hours away from Karachi. And I farmed before, and, mothers grow plants in their homes. So, I've done home gardening, but I actually started proper farming. And you realize that agriculture is entirely an act of faith. It's, there have been no rains in Pakistan this year, and I'm devastated. And I've, been on the phone and I've tried to travel. I'm like, there's no rain. I must do some prayer. Where is the rain song? All the rituals, all the practices start making amazing sense once you are dependent on some, and we're all dependent on agriculture. I mean, I'm doing it, but let's, our food comes from the labor of agriculture. So all these environmental justice movements against Monsanto, for example, which is, what is Monsanto or GM seeds? They are a war against nature. They're not conceptualized as such. Mm-hmm. It is a war against nature. And I think the intimate personal way in which, in my own little way, I could challenge them is, what is the biggest thing GM seeds and all these $68 billion plus seed companies don't want you to do? What they don't want you to do is save your own seed. They want you to buy seed, and I will not buy seed. I will save my own seed the way ancestors have done in the whole world. And that's a very small act. Like, if I keep my own seed, I have saved something of the biological heritage. So I think you come up with ecological practices that were there in spiritual and cultural frameworks, but are now radically disrupted. So I don't think you can create some spiritual return to the original. There is no agriculture in Pakistan and India without Monsanto. 90% of our cotton is Monsanto. There's no way you can return to some original glorious agriculture. So I think that if we engage with religion, we're talking about engagement with religion, but if we actually engage with nature, the faith kind of inevitably comes in. You just can't survive on science. You really can't.
So science and technology caused the problem, and now they're trying to fix it. Yeah, great. Why don't we open it up? We have about 40 or 45 minutes for talking, and I'll do my best. Please forgive me if I miss your hand. I think I saw 1, 2, 3, and then we'll get to you, Rob. Thanks. Could you identify yourself and before you talk?
Hello, my name's Damon. Just a very brief comment to begin with in defense of the word resource, and I get this from Vandana Shiva. She points out that the term originally meant resource, like a spring that returns again and again and again. It's a repeating source. And I think it's a very beautiful concept, and it automatically implies reciprocity. And so again, that comes straight from Vandana Shiva. I think it's a very different use of the term to how people typically use it within particularly within the Capitalist discourse. But my main comment really is something I'm struggling with a little bit. And so I'll share my thoughts, and probably they're contradictory, and I'm aware of that, but I thought it would be valuable to share it anyway in the context of the conversation. And that being that within anthropology recently, within the last 10 years, there's been a serious movement to try to conceptualize things like rocks as having a sense of agency, and rocks and mountains as being alive. And I found myself very resistant to that and questioning why you need to do that in order to have a sense of reverence for nature. And I realize that's a contradiction, because I agree with the indigenous perspective here, for example. I agree with this sense of reverence for nature. So I'm wondering, why on earth do I have this resistance to this scientific discourse of rocks and mountains having agency? And part of it is because I like having a distinction between something being alive and not alive. There's a valid biological concern with the snow leopard, for example, being alive or not. But I think what's really missing for me in the scientific discussion is a sense of consciousness. And for me, for something to have agency, it has to have consciousness. And we can talk about mountains from a geological perspective, and it's incredibly fascinating to do that. But if you're missing that sense of the mountain having consciousness or Earth having consciousness, for me, something is missing. And I certainly don't have an answer to this problem because, I deeply respect a biologist's perspective on the human body, for example, or mammals, animals in general. But at the same time, I think for those of us in religious traditions, we're taught to believe that a human being is not just a biological being, but a powerful spiritual force barely contained in a physical framework. Yeah. And to combine these two worldviews is really tough.
Yeah. Well, we'll do it this afternoon. It'll be fine. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, maybe I'll follow my colleagues' practice, which I thought worked well in the first session. Why don't we hear 2 or 3 questions and then bring it? I think you were next, Paul.
I just have a question about the tension between the obvious localization of the insights of Mariella and Nosheen, specific places, times, individuals, and the kinds of larger collective questions that a global perspective on climate change and environmental fragility creates with us. I think, and I don't know how to negotiate that. It's clear that the spiritual and faith-based insights that come from traditional Peruvian actors and from Muslims in the Shimshal region are specific to those places. And yet now we're aware of the way the problems are so interdependent. So I'd be interested to think about how to consider the necessarily grounded nature of our best insights with their transposability and interconnectivity.
Great, thank you. Maybe we'll stop there with those 2 questions and see who wants to.
I can go ahead. So the last question, I'm just going to repeat Tom's answer yesterday, when someone asked him about where is the global, what are you talking about? And he said, the global is the local. It is the particular. I refuse this sort of abstract global. And I actually think that's a great answer because every local has got to develop its own answer because the geography and the ecologies are very distinct. There was a famous case last year across India and Pakistan where both Delhi and Lahore had just awful smog. And they were talking to each other. So these arch enemies, India and Pakistan, they've held Kashmir hostage for 70 plus years. And when it comes to environmental catastrophe, Lahoris had to reach out to Delhi and say, what are you guys doing? What are you guys doing? Because they shared the ecological zone. Right? So that local, nobody would have thought of that Delhi and Lahore across this very contested border environmentally form a local. They form a geological zone because they're facing a very particular catastrophe that the rest of the country is not facing. So I think these locals are now being increasingly created across borders, right? And they're not the same local as the anthropological sort of one village or a particular place. So I think we have to be adaptive to these new emergencies and new climatic catastrophes that are happening and resist. I would resist the urge to say the Islamic answer to environmental ethics. I mean, I can engage in that for particular purposes at particular times, but I would resist that urge. Or the Christian answer to environmental ethics. I would say, in Notre Dame, XYZ, the Islamic answer to this. I do think that attachment to place is absolutely significant, and that notion of a place in today's ecological time is completely shifted. I have much more to share with Indian agriculturalists on seed politics than somewhere else, right? For example.
Okay, I think I'm going to answer the same question in a different way, and that is, Appadurai has this term, right? Glocalization, which is the way in which the global is always localized in particular ways, and I think this is very true for all cultures around the world. And one of the things I really wanted to draw attention to is the people I'm speaking about in the north coast of Peru. they're not shirking away from discourses of climate change. They're explaining basically the anger of the Apus and the Huacas are the symptoms of their anger is climate change. So I mean, there's a complete social engagement with what climate change means at a global level as well. They say this is where the world is going to begin to end is here in Peru, but it will end in other places as well. And people who are having visions, they're also not just having visions often of these particular Apus and Huacas in the area, although that's most common, but they've also had visions of Mount Fuji, you know, and other places in the world where there's going to be catastrophes and so on. So there's not only in terms of like an engagement with the global in terms of discourses of climate change, but also in terms of like visions and dreams, you know, which are become part of their consciousness. So I think that's something which is really important to think about. And I think, you know, thinking about the religious and also the scientific in some way when you're talking about Monsanto and so on together, I think is fundamental, right? And I think because a lot of times when people who are not really, not like you folks, right, but other people who thinking about religion and so on, they think about these as distinct processes or distinct ways of thinking, and they're clearly, enmeshed with each other and inseparable. I actually remember talking to, am I talking too much? No, you can tell me to shut up. All right. So I tend to do that. I apologize. Right. So, but I was talking with one of the biologists, for example, that I work with, and he is, he's a fantastic biologist. He's actually explaining the anger of the Apus and the Huacas, both in terms of like these biological processes and the geological processes that are happening. So why is it that suddenly that people say the mountains explode with water and they're punishing everybody? He says, well, there's a biological basis for this. And he talks about these different, phreatic, levels in the water, and there's a certain pressure that builds up and it emerges at a certain moment, and there's changes of the winds and so on, which are perfectly commensurable with the discourses of the Apus and the Huacas. And so the local people here, he's a scientist, but he's also mestizo, right? And he's also engaging with these discourses, from about sentient landscapes from those points of view. So we don't want to think about it as, separate, from the global discourses of either science or climate change, or even in the imagination.
So we have solved that. So there you go. It was worth the price of admission.
No, I didn't know.
Of course you did. Everything that everyone else says here is much more complicated than that. But I'll just do the short version. But I appreciate it. I thought it was a really rich kind of answer because I was struck by that in your talk too, that the ways in which they didn't really resist. It's not like conversations about DNA in some indigenous communities, for example, where there's really resistance about some things. But I thought there was a way in which they were merging and non-antagonistic. I think Alex was next, and then maybe Rob, is that right? And then Diane and, okay, good. Maybe, why don't we start with you, Alex, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Alex. I've been sort of struck today how we keep returning to this term of art neoliberal or neoliberalism, and how it's sort of fashionable for academics of a certain progressive or leftist stripe to use that adjective neoliberal to sort of substitute in for what theologians might call evil, just too core. I'm wondering, though, if there's a way that we can think through, or I invite our panelists to think through, what is neoliberalism, right? Especially when we juxtapose it with religion. Is neoliberalism its own kind of religion? Is it theodicy? Is it a theology? Is it a lack of religion, a lack of spirituality? If neoliberalism is the beast, what is it before we think about how we can slay it? Right?
And that's a scholar of Buddhism, by the way, in case you're not sure. Rob, did you want to add your second question? Then we'll open it up.
Sure, I have really a question for both Daniel and Nosheen. Sort of two questions. First of all, this notion of human beings being stewards and being gardeners of the planet, which at first sounds good, but I think itself is much more complicated than that. If you think about the whole question of how do we manage national parks, and people say, well, should you let 3/4 of Yellowstone Park burn or not? It's not at all clear what it means to be a gardener or a steward. And this gets into science very much and ecology. I think of the story when my wife and I were visiting the botanical gardens in The Hague, which of course is protected by dikes from the sea. And your great uncle Abdullah was taking us around, we were saying, oh, this is such an incredibly beautiful place. And pious Uncle Abdi said, yes, you should have seen it when God was the gardener. It was presumably much swampier. So the notion of gardener and steward, I think itself is not a solution, you know. The other aspect of all this is the notion of sustainable, of a carrying capacity of the environment. There's no shortage of indigenous societies in the past that clearly saw nature as sacred, and they managed to destroy their nature enough for them to collapse anyway, possibly including the Indus Valley civilization. So I'm not sure the example that you give is sufficient. Those people may have not killed the snow leopards because they just really couldn't get at them for the last 2,000 years. And there's a lot of pastures with only 1,700 people. So, I mean, that's a whole other side of this that I think we have to consider.
Go ahead.
So we'll get to the question of neoliberalism in a minute. I think your dismissal of the gardener is overly hasty for a number of reasons. One is humans are agents and need to exercise agential capacity, which is fundamentally what that's moving towards. The danger with like the metaphor of steward or gardener is that it gets pulled out of its original, here I'm following Ricoeur, out of its original semiotic matrix, and so then it becomes a free-floating symbol which anything can be attached to. So, you know, capitalist exploitation, well, that's the gardener working in the garden. So you need to connect that to the broader symbols within, since we're working with the Genesis narratives, the narrative of city builder, which is that which exhausts and dominates creation. And then you have like a tensive matrix to work in and working to discern, well, what is the work of the gardener in this particular location? What is the work of what is the damage that a city builder would do within this particular location? And here I'm referring to Cain, who kills his brother, flees God and the soil, and goes off and builds the first city, which I would take not as an urban landscape, but social structural sin. So you're correct that there's a danger there, but there's a danger with any symbol. Nature, there is a professor here, actually, David Lodge, who's now at Cornell, who talks about we need to move past ecologies of stasis and understand them in terms of ecologies of flux. Well, if nature then doesn't provide a clear ought, that's part of the work of discernment of how ought we to live in this world out of a fundamental disposition of care and service to the soil and all that comes from the soil. And there's no clear answer. There's never going to be a clear answer.
These are really difficult and fantastic questions. Danielle, right? Your name, sorry.
Damon.
Damon. Your question got missed, and I wanted to start with your question about rocks as having agency and this anthropological fascination with everyone having agency. I think there is a distinction between that discourse and rocks as sacred and spiritual. And I'm not sure where your discomfort is coming from. I think both discomforts are valid, personally. I do think that it's very hard still within academia, within education, not within popular discourse. Like if I chat with my mother and I told her that rocks have agency, she's like, hell yeah. Like, you didn't know that? Rumi said that, Falana said that, we're all one, first we were this, then we have past lives, and all these beings are talking to each other. What do you think the birds are doing? They're praying to Allah. We all know that. It's a fact of life. It is really a fact of life that bird is in direct conversation with other birds. It may not be audible to us, it may not be hearable to us, but it's perfectly within people's comprehension that birds are chatting with each other. And now people are, my students send me articles about this scientific proof that trees can feel and water can hear and birds can actually communicate, and trees, you must have seen that, the National Geographic posts something about how trees can communicate through underground root systems, where your grandmothers have always told you that. Right? So that modality is different. And I think that, I mean, we call it metaphysical or spiritual. Like I said, I'm unhappy with the English terms. I'm happy with the Urdu terms. Because in the English term, the metaphysical as stupid and eerie really comes through very strongly, or nature as de-spiritual comes through very strongly. In local languages, this is all creation. So I think we need to learn how to respect other ways of knowing, and actually other languages. I think it would be really helpful to talk about the environment in other languages to begin with. And then the whole question of agency, life and non-life will sort of be bypassed a little bit. So that's the response to that question. With the snow leopards question, yes, I mean, I don't know how civilizations emerge and then they go away. I have no clue. But snow leopards in Shimshal are considered spiritual beings. The moment you consider the ibex or their existing in the realm of fairies, you don't mess with fairies. You don't mess with spiritual beings unless you have to, and unless you have permission, and unless you have blessing. That is a very concrete mode of being and existing that is absolutely contributing to why the snow leopard is alive. If I didn't think it was special or holy, I would kill it and I would exploit it. It's not about access and not knowing where the snow leopards live. It's actually knowing pretty well where the snow leopards live. And of course, these have ecological consequences. So scientists who go to Shimshal say, the fact the high mountain ecologies are so, when they say, oh, if the butterfly dies, the bees die, everything will collapse in the world. It's kind of like that, except they think that the snow leopard are spiritual. If they die, everything else will die in the world. And that is tremendously useful to survival, not just religion. And the final question, Monsanto is evil. Let's just say that. So, I respect your introduction of the term evil into the equation. It's actually, I'm very grateful to your point, because if people, the way they talk about drones, the way people talk about the intelligence agencies in Pakistan, a lot of big companies and big state is referred to as some form of evil. Right? And the local terms are all equivalent of some form of evil. So that's actually a very interesting observation that you've made. People don't say this is the securitization of the state or this is the neoliberalism of the state. They do call it evil. And that's all I have to say to that.
Okay, yes, first of all, I want to apologize that I didn't answer your question. I got distracted with the others, and so I'm sorry I missed you. And thank you for reminding me of that as well, because I think I should respond to that. I think it's a very important question. And I really want to commend you on your honesty about your discomfort, because like a lot of people often play PC and they don't want to acknowledge this discomfort that people have with these other categories. And the reason why you're probably feeling that discomfort is because there's a fundamental problem of translation here, and that is when working with the Mestizo people, for example, you have Apu. Apu is basically a term for, it's an honorary title for a person of great leadership and knowledge. That is the mountain. It's not sacred. It's not spiritual. Those are terms that, that we've had to incorporate in order to be able to dialogue about things. Waka also has this idea of a being, it could be a thing. It could also be like a human-made monument that has a certain kind of power eradicating from it, right? So if I'm translating these as sacred landscapes, obviously a lot of things have been lost here. And I think that's where the problem is. If they're sounding hokey to you, because they're not the categories that people originally meant them to be. And that is because when you're thinking about the origin of where this terminology begins, Indigenous people are not speaking about nature and culture, and they're not separating in this way. Right? You're thinking about beings that have power, beings that have consciousness, beings that have agency, beings that have sentience, and so on. And this division between life and non-life is not really that fundamentally important in a society where you're going to be reborn at some point, right? You're going to live your life on the mountain, then you're going to die. You're going to come back through the underground rivers and you're going to be reborn on the top again, right? And this association with this mountain as the source of water in a place that's a coastal desert is fundamental for your livelihood and as well as your consciousness, you know? So I think that is what's happening here is there's a problem of terminologies. The people that I work with of mestizos, they say, okay, those are our terms, but now we have all these other terms, sacred, spiritual, and all the rest of it. We have all these new age tourists who are coming, and we give them that. And we talk about sacrality, and we talk about all these other things, because those are the people who are funding our environmental movements, right? So, you know, there's also a way in which these things can become useful in various ways.
You want to say something?
So I'll give a quick direct response to what is neoliberalism, and obviously there's myriad definitions that proliferate. From my view, so I work with kind of Polanyian thought in mind, and so I would Karl Polanyi. So I would define neoliberalism as the globalization of market society, and market society reduces the earth to land and human life to labor, and works to instrumentalize those to extract and accumulate wealth as efficiently as possible. Now, is that evil? Is instrumental logic in and of itself, by itself, evil? No, it can be put to any number of good ends. When it's absolutized in that way, without respect to the dignity of anything, then yes, it becomes the evil outcomes proliferate, and that's what we see in the world, in my view.
Great. I saw a couple of questions here. I think I might have missed you first, Diane. Did you had your hand up earlier?
Sure, I could just jump in. First of all, thank you. This is really, really a rich conversation. One of the things I heard is that all of you are making normative claims, which I really appreciate, and you're owning those normative claims. I think I want to focus on your comments, Dan, especially because I want to ask, how do you, as a Catholic theologian, is it useful for you to lay claim to your particular interpretation, a liberation theological interpretation of Roman Catholicism as you lay it out? Is it useful for you to own that particular interpretation? Because what I hear in that is I'm sitting here going, you know, I'm cheering you on from the galleys, right? Because I'm saying, yes, this is the interpretation of Roman Catholicism that I really find useful and powerful. But it's also, though, the assertion of that as just truth is what I'm asking in my own work. I think we need to claim our assertion as a value assertion and not the only assertion of the truth of the truth. And then one other related comment. The reason I thought that this might be, I'm specifically focusing it on you, is because I think it also opens up then the ownership of particular interpretations of Scripture, for example. Because 215 is terrific in terms of gardening, but 215 is also the second creation narrative that has women created out of Adam's rib. Mm-hmm. And that has incredibly problematic and contradictory, I think, ultimately, to your foundation of at least in
certainly within the history of interpretations. Yeah, absolutely.
So it's partly, again, to synthesize, I think the real question is, I would say that it's really critical to own an interpretive lens and then defend it.
Oh, and I don't disagree with you. So, I mean, this work is part of the broader project I'm working on, which the title of the book is An Ecological Theology of Liberation. And I make no bones about the fact I'm doing eco-liberationist I'm operating with our eco-liberationist hermeneutic. So I fully agree with you. And in owning it, then you have to contest and be able to argue and defend your position. Now, I think it's defensible on any number of reasons, and I think it's a particularly generative way of reading the text today to shape and energize communities of faith in accordance with what it means to witness to like God-saving work in the world, right? From the Christian imagination. And certainly there's problematic ways of pulling up this text with the history of the way it's been interpreted gender-wise. There's ways you have to address that history head on. William Brown offers a helpful interpretation of what's going on with the rib and the way that argues against that kind of subordination of women there, which I find like wholly plausible and wholly instructive, and can fit with, and I'm blinking on her name right now, but the Wake Forest biblical scholar, Text of Terrors.
Phyllis Tribble.
That builds upon that. So, and I won't try and rehearse that whole argument now, but you're absolutely right in that trying to recover a symbol, you're going to have to attend to the baggage that's laden on it, and that's an ongoing process.
I wonder if I get a couple more questions in. Please forgive me. I know you've been waiting. There's two hands in the back, and could you tell us who you are and ask the question, and then you, sir, right in front, then we'll go back. I'm doing a terrible job as presider. Please forgive me. See, we're going to repentance. Yes, ma'am.
So my name is Sofia. I'm originally from Chile, so we are neighbors. I'm studying here the Masters of Global Affairs with a concentration in sustainable development. That's the concept also a bit in discussion, I think. And even though personally, I think that my reason to pursue this is because I deeply believe in the spirituality, like my connection to nature is about, as you said, like thankfulness and respect. And that's kind of my own principle to go on the environmental issue. But when I have to go into dialogue with people from everywhere, from different disciplines, I have found that the spiritual approach is not really bridging. So I was wondering, like, if I need to actually, work in this thing, work in policy, working like practice in a non-profit in the government, how do I bring the spiritual discussion without actually cutting the dialogue that's there? Because some people will close the door, just as I feel like science can close the door for a bunch of people that really don't understand how the IPCC is talking about climate change. They're talking about the sacred concept, and all of these things that Damon was saying, he feels a bit uncomfortable with, can actually stop that from having the conversation that I feel needs to be really, really broad.
That's great. And why don't you get your question in, and then we'll turn back. And I think we have one, two. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Michael. I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate here in the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, and I work at the intersection of anthropogenic climate change and population displacement. So thank you to all of you for your work today. I really appreciate it. Mariella, my question is particularly, I wonder if you could speak a bit more. You've already touched on areas around this. If you could speak a bit more about the mestizo deployment of the category of person, the legal category of person for Afro and Waka, as you were describing. You mentioned it very briefly. I'm wondering if this deployment of the category, legal category of person is itself an artifact of a kind of structural violence, that the only form of interpretability within the legal framework is to employ that strategy. And you could think a bit more about that. I'd just be very curious. Is that a sort of double bind that people are finding themselves in, or is that a very useful, attractive category for people to be employing? And then sort of secondary question for you, Mariella, and also for you, Nosheen, is notion of some people in the anthropological community are really criticizing the environmental movement's deployment of the ideal indigenous person as a sort of image of what humans could be as protectors or collaborators with nature. I'm love to hear both of you a bit more about that. How problematic is that? Is that a useful and helpful thing to do in terms of strategy? Broad question, but I'd be curious how either of you would take that.
Thanks so much. Who wants to start?
You want to go ahead first? Sure, I'll go.
Thank you for both the questions. I think I am trained in development sociology, so I've had to engage with the terrible rhetoric of sustainable development for too long. And the problem is that the terms keep changing, but the underlying processes are just deepening, right? So the best advice I can give is speak the language of the day to whoever you have to get funds from. But stay on your own track. I think there is one track in academia and in the industry of development, and they want you to sit in the third-class cabin and just stay on that track. But we do have to get out of the train. I think Erin, right, so was saying something about, well, don't go to that table, create your own table. So, I'm a colonized person. The British gave us trains, so I keep using the train as a metaphor. So you really have to make sure you stay on your train and not lose whatever terminology in your local language or in English feels true to the experience that you are witnessing. And for me, what helps bypass the academic and leftist paranoia of spiritual is local life worlds, cultural and ecological worldviews, cultural resilience, ecological resilience, all of which is linked to faith. So this is one of the few conferences where I can say, hey, I talk about faith, yay, but it's not always easy within development sociologists to say, yeah, I take faith seriously. So that would be my comment to that. Can you repeat your question? This suspicion of the ideal indigenous figure?
It's the suspicion of the deployment of that as sort of reinscribing categories of indigeneity and being problematic precisely insofar as it does that.
Right. So, there's a whole colonial history to the noble savage and an anthropological history to this ideal, ecological being. And what has happened is that a lot of communities who are being displaced because of modern development projects, modern conservation projects, imperial projects, they have found the category of indigenous politically useful. So Karachi has a Karachi Indigenous Rights Alliance of the local fishing and rural inhabitants that are challenging big real estate from Pakistan, not colonizers, but big capitalists today. And I support that use of the category, and they translate it in Sindhi and Urdu as the inhabitants of the land. So I think it really depends on the intention. I was coming here and I was talking about indigenous environmental practices, and my scholar friend said, which indigenous? You can't use indigenous. Indigenous, do you mean this? I'm like, no, yes, I can use indigenous. I'll use the category to talk my politics. Academics will always have a
Okay, actually, the two of us, we spoke about this before. We were having this debate precisely about this question. So we're, on board with this. I have worked with Mapuche shamans in southern Chile for many years, and I constantly get this from, people in the NGOs, the activists, academics as well, which is, you're going out doing these weird things with shamans that have nothing to do with politics, with development, with anything relevant, with production of knowledge, with science, with medicine, nothing. It's just gossip and old ladies' thoughts, right? So one of the things that we need to think about is like, where are they coming from? Right? And I agree with you in terms of, I use the language of the day, whatever works is what's ever going to get me funding. I construct whatever I'm doing in a way that's going to be useful. Absolutely. But at the same time, when I'm writing and when I'm engaging in my own kind of academic discourse, I'm like, okay, you want to really think about why are you using these discourses, and what are the kind of colonial kind of enterprise you're bringing with you when you're asking indigenous people particularly to secularize your discourses in order to be believable and serious? What kind of colonialism is that? And why do you feel the right that you can impose this discourse on us? So if you begin with that and sort of deconstruct the language where it's coming from, I think you come in a much more powerful place. And the second thing I would do, of course, I don't work with Abrahamic religion, so I'm coming obviously from an indigenous practice perspective, but they don't think about it as spirituality either. This whole discourse of what is religion and spirituality is not really something that they're engaging with. They talk about it as healing, as living, as confronting the other, as managing the world, as creating worlds, as all those kinds of things, transforming reality. Those are the ways in which they're speaking about the practice, the shamans themselves, right? So I think that's also another useful thing to think about. And also when they bring those kind of discourses to you, give them concrete examples. You say, really, I'm in Chile. Do you know at this moment, there are 5 shamans in jail on charges of terrorism for challenging, the state discourses. Now, how is that not political? And why is it then that spirituality is not important in thinking about environment, politics, and local mobilization movements? So it depends how aggressive you want to be, But these are the things that you can deploy if you wish, right? The other thing I would say is that the idea of illegal personhood, right? This is it's not something which is just unique to the people in the north coast of Peru. In fact, I have to say that there's been people in New Zealand, India, Bolivia, Ecuador, who've all found, this sort of like this recognition of the legal personhood of nature, which is also in itself complicated because in Bolivia, for example, the recognition of Pachamama as having legal personhood has done nothing to stop the extractivist industry. It's sort of like a rhetoric, right? But at least it's there in the terms of discourses that people say, oh, of course, Pachamama exists. And it's become part of everyday discourse. So you don't have to go to the kind of explaining that you have to do in Chile, right? So that is sort of one thing there. The idea of rights of nature, I mean, I think it's complicated from two things. One, you're creating nature, right? Which of course is part of the problem that what I don't want to do. You want to separate nature from the human in this particular case. But if you are thinking, if people talk about the rights of nature as one of the ways in which you can recognize it legally, but there have been people who've basically recognized the personhood of nature. Again, we have this word, right? Nature, which is there. And I think I told the people in the North Coast of Peru about this 4 years ago. And I translated, so this is partly my doing, I translated the documents that they were in English, and I gave them the documents in Spanish to showing how Bolivia and Ecuador had done them. And I also made the contacts with them, with the lawyers in Ecuador and Bolivia who had been able to pass those laws. So that's where that is coming from. And is it another form of structural violence? In the world that they're living, where their livelihood is in question, where their houses are being flooded, by these, every year there's tremendous floods and the government is doing nothing to reconstruct it, where they're getting cancer and respiratory problems from working in the mines and their water's completely contaminated. They're going to grab anything they can in order to be able to live a livelihood that's going to be meaningful and also allow them to continue, in their next generation. So it's I should say useful.
I would say the word indigenous, because the UN uses it. I had to write an afterword for a volume about global indigeneity, which terrified me, but I did it. But all of the folks who were contributors to this were all saying that for strategic purposes, that's a legal term on which we can make claims.
Exactly.
It's now recognized, so we're going to say indigeneity because that's the word that's in key intergovernmental agency documents. So yep, we're indigenous, and whatever we call ourselves when we're alone, we're indigenous publicly because we want that land back. So it's strategic reason. So I think you were waiting, and I think Tim was waiting a very long time. And then you want to get into Uri, okay.
Taking too long to answer.
We're just having rich. We are what we are, yes.
Eva Kova, a sociology PhD. My question is going to be ask it to Nosheen. I was wondering if your presentation could be read as a particular critique of the modern Western conception of human selfhood and the dichotomous view of human and nature in that particular perception. Because my reading of your presentation was really kind of different, perhaps alternative presentation of selfhood in which there is a constitutive relationship between human and nature. I mean, one of your interviewees said that he or she learned from nature, which is really at odds with a particular Western secular conception of human personhood, which prioritizes human mind over nature and over body and over ritual. And so just your thoughts on that.
Great, thank you. And Tim, you want to ask your question?
Sure, Tim Madavina, Theology. You've all spoken, Tom, you summarized the importance of spirituality. Nosheen, yesterday you said the word faith, religion as an actor that we have to critically examine in global affairs. This is a mission of the Keough Institute. And you've all also spoken about how sometimes your colleagues, Nosheen just said, outside of this conversation, sometimes there's resistance to that. Is there any way you can give advice to us or to Tom, the Keough Institute, Keough School of Global Affairs, it's already, how do you overcome that resistance to making religion a critical conversation partner in conversations about, I mean, that seems to be part and parcel of the mission here. What advice would you give us on how to effectively overcome, kind of resistance, or at least kind of, desire to not think too much about that in those wider conversations here and then beyond Notre Dame?
That's right. Erin, was your question related to these kinds? Okay, great.
Yeah, I approve of that interpretation. I don't know what else to say. It is a commentary on on life, right? So nature is life, nature is source of life, and to think that humans are not part of that form of life is pure, would be considered false in a lot of religious frameworks. I mean, I grew up knowing that I'm made of 5 elements: earth, water, fire. That I am 70% water in my science classes, and at home I'm told that I'm made up of the 5 elements. So there was not as much incongruency as science would like to believe, right? There is some, I think you're absolutely right in getting to the question of selfhood. I admit I haven't thought too much from that angle, but I think the faith versus reason divide, the body versus soul divide, the whole list of binaries that came with the Enlightenment, that came, at a political time with the church versus state battle and in a particular place, has had huge significance for the whole world, which is now locked in these binaries. So sometimes when I write, a friend of mine told me, you sound like a believer. You won't be taken seriously. So don't just tone yourself down, temper it. I'm like, actually, this is a quotation from people. How do I temper this down? It's literally speaking for itself. The language is speaking for itself. I don't have to make a claim that I am a Muslim person, so for me, nature is sacred. Well, the language means that nature is sacred. It's a fact. And this fact versus feeling that, so the larger question that I want to kind of throw back at you is that you're always interpreted based on the positionality that people ascribe to you. So wherever I go, I'm seen first as a Muslim or a brown woman. And so people think if I have to talk about religion, I must talk about gender, and if I say I actually talk about Muslim culture, this is not what they expect, ever. They expect violence, or they expect Abrahamic faith, some construction of the Abrahamic faiths. Abrahamic faiths are not mutually incompatible or divorced from indigenous thought at all. I mean, 1 billion Muslims around the world, majority of them are living in indigenous contexts. They're not living in cities. You go to Indonesia or India or Pakistan, they have much more in common with people in Peru than I don't know, people like me. So that's all I have to say.
This will probably be our last answers, because I want to get people out of time. Dan,
It's a great question, Tim. I think for me as a theologian, I think of my work, obviously I'm trying to do academically responsible work, but I think about it more as serving a ecclesial and public function. And so it should translate into a spirituality that witnesses, that's incarnated publicly. And that's where the discussion emerges from, is from the way that life is lived in community in a public political manner. So Martin Luther King's work, right, to use an example, the discussion isn't him trying to articulate at a theoretical level the role in which religion is playing here. It's just plain and simple. It's obvious that the Poor People's Campaign and the marches that preceded it are an expression of a spirituality that's tied to a theology and that's being made public. And from there, then you can have academic discourse on the phenomenology of that witness, but it's towards energizing and orienting that witness that I see the work of theology should be most concerned with, or at least oriented to.
I think we're done.
you don't want the last word?
No.
Well, we'll let you go. It's been a wonderful day. Thank you so much for coming. Please join me in thanking this panel for the wonderful